All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first of many webinars from Dr. Marion's Learning Lab, where we'll be addressing a whole range of important issues in reading, learning, and school success. My name is Sarah Savari, and I will be hosting today's event. I am a former teacher turned education coordinator at Dr. Marion's Learning Lab. And as today's host, I will be able to view and present any questions you may have for Dr. Blank through the question and answer box that is available on all of your screens. So please feel free at any time to type any questions you'd like Dr. Blank to answer in that Q&A box. And if we cannot answer them during the session, we'll try to answer them at the end. All right, well, I'm just honored to be joined by award-winning psychologist Dr. Blank. For those of you who are not familiar with her work, she's well known internationally for her many contributions to understanding and enhancing children's learning. Hi, Dr. Blank, and thank you for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Wonderful. Well, I am so excited to dive in and learn more from you. So we're going to begin with today's topic of understanding and enhancing classroom discourse.
Okay, are we ready?
Here we go. Yep.
Okay, actually, let's go back to the title because I just want to leave that on for a minute.
Sure.
Classroom discourse, like any language situation, has a lot of components. And today I'm going to be concentrating on one of its components, which is the material that is presented for educational purposes to the students. Lots of other things go on in a classroom. There are all kinds of rules for the day, and there's management things. And we're not going to be discussing any of those. We're just going to be discussing classroom discourse, which ostensibly is designed to help children learn and enhance their academic functioning. Next slide.
Oh, sorry. Hold on one second. There you go.
Okay. Now, there is a dominant pattern of classroom discourse. It's really quite amazing. I've been in many countries in the world, and they all have the same basic pattern. The instructional time, the vast percentage of the instructional time, consists of verbal exchanges where the teacher initiates, the student responds, and then the teacher evaluates and moves on really to the next student. So here's a typical example. Teacher, what is the main idea of the passage? Student, and note that this is a very brief question. It offers no context. This is very typical. And teachers have told me that they feel an enormous pressure to go as fast as possible so they don't lose the class. Part of the idea of asking these quick questions is to hold on to the students. And so the student answers, and this is another typical response, always persevere. The children do not have to speak in complete sentences. It's as if there's a shorthand going on between the teacher and the student. Always persevere. Teacher says, very good, Joseph. Interestingly, I'll just anticipate a little, if Joseph had not been correct, the most likely thing the teacher would have done is turn to another student and say, oh, okay, Sarah, what's your thought? Or what's your answer? And now you've got the classroom dialogue. It's amazingly simple and actually amazingly unproductive. Let's move on.
Yeah. I apologize. There's a little bit of a lag today. There we go.
Okay, well, we can't. We have to live with what we have to live with. Okay. Now, the content of the questions, it's full of questions. The context topics are decontextualized. And by that, I mean they're presented in ways that are very similar to the concepts in an encyclopedia, like category, insects, weather, habitat, Georgia, whatever you're looking up. And they are then discussed, and this is not discussed a lot, through individual disconnected exchanges. And the questions are posed with little supportive comment or context. So it'll be things like, what do you see there? Do you know what this is called? Which part goes first? These are obviously only a sample, but these are very typical of the questions that teachers ask. And they're doing what they've been trained to do. And unfortunately, their training leaves a lot to be desired. And this is an interesting side issue that isn't recognized sufficiently. One of the reasons, basically, what teachers often do is ask a lot of memory questions, like who knows who Abraham Lincoln was, or when did the Civil War end, and there's a huge number of memory questions. And the reason they exist is because originally, when mass education started, books were very expensive, and there was only one book to a classroom. And the teacher's role was to ensure that every child remembered or took in everything that was in that book. And the only way the teacher could know if that was the case was to ask memory questions. So what did you see on such and such? And those memory questions have continued to this day. The ones I gave the samples here are not memory questions, but the memory questions tend to dominate.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely.
Now, what I want to show is a topic that is not considered that much, but it's the effect of having a decontextualized concept. So, for example, I'm going to take a very simple thing. Assume you're teaching the concept of baby. And what you're going to get in these decontextualized concepts is a whole set of related possibilities, related associations to the concept of baby. So they'll discuss the size, they'll discuss his behavior, they'll discuss the interaction with people, they'll discuss the sleep pattern. Anything and everything can come up, just as it can come up in an encyclopedia. And this is very different from the discussion of a meaningful concept that people need to understand the world. Let's move on. So here are some examples. So what things are babies dependent upon for survival? You can make it easier phrasing. You can say, what things do babies need? What are babies' ways of communicating? What similarities are there between baby animals and baby mammals? What are similarity and questions of this sort? Can be anything. What are some cultural practices in raising babies? It's almost anything connected with the idea of babies is allowed to come into the talk. And we're so used to it that it doesn't even seem wrong. But if this is basically the only social situation in which you're asked questions like these. So let's move on, if we can change it, and change to something much more meaningful.
That sounds great.
Yeah. Okay. Now, what I'm going to raise now is a concept that unfortunately is not given sufficient attention. It's the concept of text. We don't just speak words, we don't just speak sentences, we actually speak in texts. A book is a text, and so is a good conversation. In other words, it's a series of connected sentences where the ideas build up one upon the other. And unless you have connected sentences, you will never have a memorable or meaningful set of exchanges. So what makes a meaningful setting? What makes a meaningful topic? Can we have the next slide?
Yes.
Okay, now what I've taken is, and this is really interesting, what we now have very few newspapers, so people probably not even think of newspapers. But newspapers before, when they were common, always wrote in what I call predicated concepts, meaning that you take the noun you're discussing, the war, the gold find, a baby, a discovery, and you add to it the words that would follow in a sentence. That's the predicate. And the predicate totally changes everything if you start using it. Now, believe it or not, the headline that I gave here is a true headline that appeared about 20, 25 years ago, when there were medical experiments and a baby who was dying at birth was given a baboon's heart in the hope that it would help them to live. Now, the interesting thing is, if you say to someone, What do you think is going to be in this article? They will tell you the issue. It's highly predictable. They'll say, well, they'll discuss the medical procedures. They'll discuss the ethics of this. They'll discuss the success of the operation. They'll discuss the likely outcome. So I'll say to audiences, gee, you know exactly what's in the article. Why do you bother reading it? Because the fact of the matter is that we only can take in a certain amount of new information to topics we already know. You cannot take a topic out of the blue and present it in an educational setting or in any other setting. The people have to have some familiarity with it so they understand what you're talking about. So the amount of new information that you're going to be able to give in any discussion is small. It's manageable, and it's readily incorporated into the available frameworks. So if you'll also note, none of the associations to baby that you would ask people, if you say, give me some association, none of those associations matter, and they're not discussed because they're totally irrelevant to a true predicated topic. And predicated topics must be the foundation, I think, of any good educational discussion. Now, the interesting thing is the power that these can have has grown, although it's not being explored, in the age of the computer. Predicated concepts were more commonly available to children because they frequently there were many more children who had good discussions at home with their parents. That type of discussion is practically disappeared in the current age of the computer. Parents do not talk at length. Very few parents talk at length with their children about important topics. Everybody is on their own device. You've got to, the average 2-year-old in America spends 8 hours a day on a device. And that doesn't go down as the person goes. So pretty much every free moment, or what would be a free moment, is spent on a device. They're not engaging in meaningful conversation. And so one of the enormous payoffs of switching classroom dialogue to this kind of discussion, first of all, it's much more interesting, but it allows the child to get some familiarity with what are known as expository or informational texts. In other words, at about 4th grade, it'll vary slightly from some country to country, but about 4th grade, the books begin presenting to the children meaningful information on important topics. The children currently have no familiarity, most children have no familiarity whatsoever with informational texts. And if the classroom discourse is a perfect setting for giving them that familiarity, because they have the children, they've got the topics, and they really have the opportunity to really develop this aspect of language. This aspect of language is absolutely critical to school success. And most students today, unfortunately in the United States, graduate from high school without any foundation in this area. The average achievement of a high school graduate is 5th grade reading level. They cannot understand text at 6th, 7th grade. So if we want to have an educated population that can really attend to meaningful topics, this is an absolutely vital area to develop. And it's an area that we're tremendously ignoring.
Wow. So you mentioned that the expository texts are introduced at 4th grade level?
Roughly.
And before that, what are they really mainly learning? Like what kinds of texts?
They're basically well, first of all, they're learning very few texts in general, because so much work is going on in phonics. Phonics just keeps expanding its curriculum to do phonemic analysis, to do word analysis, to do a whole bunch of things. So they're not really getting much text, but to the degree that they do, they're getting simple narratives.
I see.
And the narratives of phonics texts are super. They're not even good narratives because the texts are so simple. The children could, but are not getting for the most part. They could get very good narrative texts if people read the stories to them or used videos that are available. And but they're not, in general, they're not getting it. And then they're suddenly switched at about fourth grade from essentially almost no meaningful text into these heavy informational texts that are very poorly developed because people have not thought about the language constraints that you need to really reach children.
And it sounds like after fourth grade, it continues with them.
Oh,
They
yes.
continue to be exposed to these texts and they never got the training they needed before that switch happened.
Exactly. And
Oh,
the thing that changes about the expository text is they just get harder and harder. In other words,
correct.
the vocabulary increases, the sentence structure increases. So let's say, I don't know the exact figures, but let's say in fourth grade, the average sentence length is 12 words. In sixth grade, it's 18 words, or they're getting 18 to 20 word sentences. Now, many children now, because of the problems in not being exposed to complex language, just simply can't handle it. One of the things I did years ago when I became aware of this, I remember showing interesting informational videos to children
Mhm.
on topics they love. One of them was, for example, the development of baseball. And the kids loved baseball. Within 5 sentences, they were lost when they heard what the narrator was saying. Because
Oh,
they'd say, back in the 18th century, when the country was just started, blah, 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 baseball had its beginning roots. And I'd say to a child, tell me what he just said. And he says, I can't. I can't. The average American child cannot imitate a sentence of 12 or 14 words. Now that sort of says, well, why should they? It's just an excellent marker for assessing some of their language skills. And their language skills now are very, very problematic.
mm. Well, this
So
is,
it's a
yeah.
big, big issue. Fortunately, we have solutions if we're willing to try
Yes,
implementing the solutions. That's the good. I wouldn't be talking about this if I didn't think we had solutions. What's the point of adding to the problems we already know we have? But the solutions here make it more interesting for the teacher and more interesting for the child and the children.
absolutely.
Yeah,
And that's so exciting that we have the solutions. And we're not just talking about the problems now, like we're finding solutions and there's our solutions. So, like you said, we just have to be willing to learn about it and try it.
yeah. And
Okay. Yeah.
but it will take some time to train teachers, and we've got to be willing to put in the money and the time and the commitment to make that change.
Yes.
But that's another issue not to be discussed today.
Yeah. Another webinar, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. No,
Okay.
these are all good issues. Now,
Yes.
for those of people who are interested in learning about I call them predicated concept. I now have changed it to call it narrex, just because it's sort of simpler and clearer. Narrex meaning it's a combination of a narrative text and an expository text, but it's basically the same as a predicated concept. So one of the best writers, and anyone who wants to read any of her books should really try to get them. She's a marvelous, marvelous writer, Jean Fritz. She writes across the age span from very young children to college students. And so, for example, one of her books, almost all her books titles are predicated concepts. It's not the Constitution. It's we're writing the Constitution. So
Mhm.
I've said to kids when I use this book with them, I'll say to them, what do you think this is about? Well, they said, well, the Constitution was very important. They wanted a quiet room to work in. So they said, shh. And I said, that's a good idea. But in fact, these were very rich guys and they didn't have to worry about finding a quiet room. They had tons of quiet rooms. I said, why else do you say shh? And then the kids look at me, when you're telling a secret. I say, right. They say, the Constitution was a secret? And I said, yep, the Constitution was a secret. And I explained why. What happened is the people who had tried to develop the Constitution knew that the opposing forces were very powerful. They didn't want to give them any time to build up against them. So they set things up that it was a total secret until they just put it before them, and the opposition had no time to mobilize the opposition. That's how the Constitution got done, which nobody talks about, but it's a fact. You need to understand the provisions in the Constitution, but it's also very important to understand the fights that were going on about the Constitution, and the fact the country was very divided as to whether they would have a Constitution or stick with the much simpler, ineffective system, the Confederate articles that they had been using for years. Okay.
And honestly, how much more interesting is it to learn about the Constitution with the background knowledge you just provided? So,
Of course,
yeah.
that's the great thing about a predicated concept. It gives you the motivational appeal of a novel. And
Right.
human life is fascinating. So when you begin to put in these issues, the information is much easier to accept and hold on to. Whereas straight expository information is really only for the geeks. They like it, but aside from that, nothing else does. Then when you, if you take Can't You Make Them Behave, King George, you get the idea. This is a feckless king who lost control of the colonies. And so she's saying, can't you make them behave, King George? And poor King George could not make the colonists behave. And so they lost, England lost America. And the double life of Pocahontas, you don't know quite where it's going, but basically it's that she lived the life in the white community and she lived a life in the Indian community or Native American community. And that was a very, very complex and interesting situation. So if you, a predicated concept gives you the motivation of a narrative and the exposition of a topic. And that can hold in social studies, science, everywhere, biography, everywhere.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to read those books because of those titles.
Oh, yeah. Now, you shouldn't be misled by a long title and think it's a predicated concept. Lots of times they add parts to a title, but it doesn't tell you anything. National Geographic Kids, why not? Over 1,100 answers to everything. Well, that's nice. It's interesting, but you don't have a clue as to what's inside. Is this going to be answers to physics? Is this going to be answers to mysteries? Is this going to be answers to, you have no idea. And that well, you might find it by going to the book, but I think the books should have it in their titles so that people are more set to receive the information. Like the science book, big ideas simply explained. Well, that's appealing, but which big ideas and why are you picking on those ones? Again, awesome science experiments for kids, 100 STEM project. So there's nothing wrong with these books, but they are going to be, I can guarantee you, much harder to impart, to get the kids to understand the information in them, because the people who set them up weren't thinking of the needs of the children and what you have to do to hook a child into a topic so the child feels competent.
And I will tell you, as a teacher at the book fairs and the libraries, a lot of our kids reached for, they felt the pull of these books based on these titles and they would grab them. But if I asked, what did you learn? What was in the book? It's a series of disconnected ideas and they can't really tell me what they learned a lot of the time.
Right. Yeah, it's very hard.
Yeah.
Because disconnected information is much harder memory-wise than connected information.
Yeah.
So, we're not using the natural human qualities that children have. One of the reasons kids love narratives is because they know from practically day one, if not day one, maybe day 365 when they're in the starting their second year, they know what other people are like and what other people, they immediately identify. They've got a base of information that allows them to move on. These disconnected facts give no such base of information. And that one of the interesting things, of course, is narratives are universal. Right. And one of the more interesting and disturbing things is that in the age of the new high-tech age, we may be losing the narrative, which would be, I think, be a massive, massive catastrophe.
It would be.
Yeah. If we'd be losing something that humanity has had for thousands of years, and it really is universal. Every culture has these kind of stories. And if we stop these stories, I think we're going to be losing a tremendous amount of the human culture.
Yeah. Oh,
So we'd be doing two things. We'll be saving these stories, and we'll be able to actually create an informed population at the same time.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Now here again, it's not hard to learn what's
Mhm.
going on, but I'm just giving these as example.
Good. Yeah.
These are, for example, in National Geographic, Chapter 2, Why on Earth? Now, on Why on Earth, worldview, spinning in circles, tilt-a-whirl, life as we know it, change is good. Don't have a clue, but you know they're talking about Earth, but you don't have a clue as to how they're presenting the topic of Earth. What is worldview? What is spinning in circle?
Right.
This doesn't prepare. It sounds cute. It
Hmm.
and this why they're able to get this cuteness in is an interesting problem. I think Americans are brilliant at advertising, and this shows that effect, but it's not at all a helpful thing for the children.
No.
1,100 answers to everything. Well, maybe, but you could also say 1,100 questions about everything.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, well, this is a very good example to see that.
Yeah, so it is not
Yeah,
simply that it looks like so that it looks like a predicated concept. It has to be a predicated. So a
exactly.
non-predicated is bird populations. Again, you don't know if you're going to be talking about extinction, if you're going to be talking about geographic distribution, if you're going to be talking about changes. You don't know. Same thing with the humpback whale. Whereas if it's predicate like de-extinction, the beginning, the signs of bringing lost species back to life, you know not precisely, but very clearly where it's heading. And it's a fascinating topic. And it's very hopeful because we hear so much about extinction. So here's somebody coming in with the idea that you can bring lost species back to life. It's fascinating.
Right.
The sixth extinction in unnatural history. That's a bit hard, but if you need a bigger knowledge base to handle that. Now, Silent Spring, I just brought in, that was a book by Rachel Carson, which changed the world. She was writing about the use of pesticides, and she
Oh,
called Silent Spring because she said we're killing off everything, and our spring, instead of flourishing with new life, is going to be silent. So you can make it a little bit mysterious. You can make it more open. But if you start thinking in terms of a predicated concept or a narrex text, we can transform the educational scene, and we can enable a huge number of children to function much more effectively in school.
absolutely.
Currently now, the kids are just frightened. They get these assignments and they're just praying they've got through them.
Yeah. I can definitely see the difference between these two, and I could see yeah, like it's even for me as an adult, imagine a child. I can understand the difference between the two, and like I have an idea of what the predicated concepts are talking about, and that's so important for an adult, so I let alone a child.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just something that's very meaningful, and
Yeah.
it's an interesting blend when you combine the narrative and expository text. It's a new people have been using it, obviously, like Gene Fritz, but it's a new people are not aware of it, and making them aware of it will, first of all, it'll help parents pick out books for their children. Parents will say to me, what book
Yeah.
should I give? And if parents, keeping in mind the grade level, the vocabulary level, they can pick out much better books for their kids.
Wow.
And by the way, we can start, and we should be starting, we can start 3 and 4-year-olds on simple narrex texts, so that they have a much better knowledge base when they enter kindergarten and first grade, and second grade and so on, than they have till now. In other words, we can, through oral language and good books, create a much firmer base that will allow the children to flourish in education.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Now, I just want to mention something there. It's not essential to this, but it's, I think, important. There was a very famous Russian social scientist, Vygotsky, and he made an important distinction between what he called everyday concepts and science concepts. Everyday concepts are the concepts children pick up from just living. They figure out that if they turn a cup of juice upside down, a bowl of water pours out. They figure out that if they put their glove on their foot, it's not going to fit so well. They experiment with the world and they learn a tremendous amount. And they basically don't need an adult for most of this. It's nice if they have one around, but they don't. It's just from exploring the world. They get the information that they need. But science concepts are not like that. You can't pick them up en passant like that.
Mhm.
And they're conveyed through very complex discourse. That discourse, by the way, is rooted in the rhetoric of the Greek and Roman civilization. So it's been around for a long time. But that's, and basically narratives is one form of the discourse pattern that I'm saying we've got to adapt in our culture if we want knowledgeable citizens, because people cannot pick these things up on their own. They have to be taught, and you want to teach it in a much more interesting, appealing way than is currently being done.
That makes so much sense.
So what I'm suggesting is that the classroom dialogue is governed by a predicated concept, and teachers be given all the support materials they need to bring the concept to life, that teachers be given the training to know how to both offer comments and questions in a much more meaningful way. Teachers today have a tremendous amount of difficulty because it's not in their training to put comments around their questions. And when I was doing a lot more teacher training some years back. I wouldn't allow a teacher to ask in the training, to ask a question if that teacher could not put a statement, a comment around the question that made the question easier to understand. So you look a little puzzled. So so if you're going to sort of say, you want the child to notice, let's say, that the size of a particular ball is very small, you could make comments like, most balls are about this size, and you give a few examples, and some are even bigger. But here we have the tiniest ball I've ever seen. Why do you think it's so tiny? I'm just giving you an example.
Yeah.
The idea is, if the teacher has good material to teach, she should, it's usually she, but it's also he at times, he or she should be able to embed it in comments that help the child understand where the question is going to take them. And that requires, it only takes a few months training. And when teachers can do this, their teaching is tremendously enhanced, because it's and what it does is it slows down the pace of the exchange, which makes it much easier for students to understand. I once was working with a very bright girl, high school girl, who had a very severe ADD. And she says to me, she says, I can listen when the teacher talks. She says, I hate it when the students talk. Most of the time they're giving wrong responses, and I can't figure out how to discard those responses. And it just leaves me with a mess in my head. So if the teacher, and I mention this because very often they say the teacher talks too much. I said, that's a ridiculous idea. It depends on the context and what's needed. I'm not at all against teachers talking more, but they have to talk better. And talking better means that they've got to talk in comments that are very well suited to the questions that they're asking and that connect the ideas. It's a totally different form of teacher discourse. And once you've got it, you can teach everywhere and anywhere. I've been in countries in the world where I've just been put into a classroom, and I tell the teacher in English what I would say, and she tries it on this kid who's never seen me, and she translates it, and it works. It's just an amazingly effective form, because it's a much easier way to handle language. We've made language unnecessarily difficult and producing far too much failure.
Absolutely. Okay, so it actually looks like we've unfortunately run out of time for any more questions. But if you do have, for any of our attendees, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to go to our website at dmlearninglab.com and direct your questions there, and we would be more than happy to answer them. So for our wonderful attendees, thank you so much for joining us and being here today. And Dr. Blank, I cannot thank you enough for your time. This was so valuable and provided so much information for me, other parents, teachers, and students, and it's going to make a world of difference. So thank you so much for your time today.
No, it's been a pleasure.
Wonderful. Bye, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Okay,
I'm going to go ahead and end this. And Dr. Marion, I'm going to call you in a second, okay?
okay, I'll
All
be
right.
on my phone.
Okay.